This is the story of a great weapon obscured by a greater myth. It is the story of the M4 Sherman, not as the technological marvel that won the war for logistics and production, but as the maligned tank that went to battle with a handicap and the single modification that finally allowed its crews to look a tiger in the eye and fight back. This is the story of the 76mm gun, the high-velocity equalizer that delivered hope to the tankers of the Western Front. For decades, the popular narrative of the American M4 Sherman tank has been written in the blood and fire of its early, devastating encounters with German heavy armor. The common image is one of a flawed, vulnerable machine, a fiery coffin for its crew, facing down the formidable might of the Panther and the Tiger. This perception, codified in memoirs and cemented by popular history, stems from a terrifying and undeniable reality that greeted American and British troops as they landed in Normandy. The early Sherman's primary weapon, the 75mm cannon, was critically outmatched. The M4 Sherman was born of necessity and industrial genius. Conceived in the desperate months following Pearl Harbor, it was designed to be produced quickly, reliably, and in massive numbers. Its 75mm gun was, by 1942 standards, perfectly adequate, a multi-purpose weapon capable of firing both effective high-explosive (HE) shells against infantry and anti-tank (AP) rounds against the existing German Panzer III and Panzer IV models. It was, essentially, a tool built for the war that America expected to fight, a war of maneuver, close support, and exploiting breakthroughs. But the Germans did not fight the expected war. By the time the Sherman truly arrived in force on the battlefields of Europe, the German response had already materialized. The Panther, with its sloped, thick frontal armor and its long, high-velocity 7.5cm gun, and the Tiger, a veritable behemoth of steel and terror, rendered the Sherman 75mm M3 gun functionally obsolete in a frontal confrontation. Tank crews quickly realized they were entering a gunfight with a pistol. The M4's basic armor, while sufficient against most battlefield threats, was easily defeated by the long-barreled German cannon at ranges of 1,000 yards or more. In turn, the 75mm Sherman had to close to point-blank range, often less than 200 yards, to have any chance of penetrating the Panther's glacis or finding a weak spot on the Tiger. This disparity was not just a technical problem, it was a devastating psychological affliction. The early Sherman was reliable, it was fast, and its coaxial machine gun was excellent for supporting infantry. But when the tank commander was ordered to engage a Panther, he was essentially being asked to play Russian roulette with his crew. The M4 carried a reputation for being easily set alight, earning the grim nickname Ronson from some crews, a reference to the lighter company's slogan, "Lights every time." While statistics show the Sherman was not uniquely prone to catching fire compared to its German counterparts, the ease with which its smaller gun was countered and its armor breached fueled this myth. The dread was real, and it permeated the ranks. The very symbol of American armored might, the Sherman felt less like a liberator and more like bait. The problem, therefore, was clear: the American tank could not consistently defeat the German tank, but the German tank could consistently defeat the American tank. The crisis was not just about the thickness of the steel, but the velocity of the projectile. The 75mm gun simply did not have the muzzle velocity or the mass of propellant to reliably punch through the heavily hardened steel of the new German cats. The solution had to be drastic, and it had to be fast. The solution, already gathering dust in the halls of the Ordnance Department, was the 76mm M1 gun. The push for a better gun was not born in the fields of Normandy, it was born years earlier in the cold, hard logic of the Ordnance Department and the frustrated demands of tank developers. As early as 1941, American ordnance engineers realized that the 75mm would not hold up for the entire duration of the conflict. They had been working on a new weapon, a high-velocity, 76mm cannon, that was designed for better armor penetration, recognizing that the trajectory of tank development was toward heavier armor. This 76mm M1 gun represented a significant leap forward, firing a lighter projectile than the 75mm but at a much higher muzzle velocity, over 2,600 feet per second, compared to the 75mm's 2,050 feet per second. Velocity, in anti-tank warfare, is kinetic energy, and kinetic energy is penetration. The 76mm gun offered a potential solution, but its introduction was hampered by a massive bureaucratic and doctrinal roadblock. The man at the center of this resistance was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the head of the Army Ground Forces. McNair was a staunch advocate of the doctrine of combined arms, believing that the primary role of the tank was infantry support and exploitation, while dedicated tank destroyers, such as the M10 and M18 Hellcat, were the proper tools for engaging enemy armor. McNair's reasoning was sound, if ultimately misguided in the context of the European battlefield. He argued that fitting the Sherman with a heavier gun would compromise its multi-role capability. The 76mm gun had a less effective high-explosive shell, which was crucial for dealing with enemy infantry and fixed positions, the vast majority of threats the tank faced. McNair feared that if the tank was given a dedicated anti-tank gun, commanders would begin using it purely as a tank destroyer, thus neglecting its primary mission of supporting the advance. In the American doctrine, the dedicated anti-tank weapon was the way to stop enemy armor. This doctrinal rigidity led to a critical delay. The initial batches of 76mm Shermans, designated the M for A1 and M for A3, were ready for shipment in late 1943, but McNair refused to deploy them. His decision, rooted in a pre-war doctrine, meant that when the D-Day landings occurred in June 1944, the majority of the tanks pouring onto the beaches were still equipped with the original, inadequate 75mm gun. This initial delay would cost American tankers dearly in the hedgerows of Normandy, where the close-quarters fighting often forced Shermans into direct, suicidal engagements with German heavy tanks. However, the reality of combat quickly overruled the doctrine. The sheer shock and ferocity of encountering the German heavy tanks, especially the Panthers that formed the core of the Armored Reserve, generated a wave of reports and urgent demands back to Washington. The stories were unanimous: the 75mm gun was useless. A compelling example of the growing desperation can be found in a letter from General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, who wrote urgently about the necessity of fielding the 76mm as soon as possible, stating the crews needed the psychological boost as much as the improved performance. The tankers had lost confidence in their weapon, and in warfare, confidence can be as vital as firepower. The Ordnance Department, which had always championed the 76mm, finally won the bureaucratic battle in the face of overwhelming combat evidence. The first M for tanks mounting the 76mm M1 gun began arriving in Normandy in July 1944. They were an immediate, if partial, answer to the tankers' prayers, an assurance that their concerns had been heard, and that they were finally receiving a weapon designed to compete. The arrival of the first 76mm Shermans was initially met with a mixture of excitement and caution. Excitement, because it was a tangible acknowledgement of the firepower deficit; caution, because the new tank was not the silver bullet many hoped it would be. The 76mm M1 gun, while a significant upgrade over the 75mm, still struggled against the frontal armor of the Panther tank, particularly the steeply sloped glacis plate, which offered a tremendously effective degree of protection. While the 75mm had virtually no chance, the standard armor-piercing round, AP, of the 76mm had to hit the Panther's front at relatively close range, often under 500 yards, and at a favorable angle to penetrate. In the close, constricted terrain of the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, 500 yards was an engagement distance, not a safe combat range. The initial disappointment was palpable. Many crews had believed the 76mm would be the miracle weapon, capable of knocking out any German tank at any range. When the new rounds bounced off the frontal armor of a Panther, an experience that became terrifyingly common in the tank battles of late summer 1944, the feeling of despair only deepened. The tankers were given a new gun, but the problem, the existential dread of facing a superior opponent, had not vanished. This disappointment was exacerbated by another factor: the new 76mm gun forced the use of a larger turret, which, in the M for A1 and early M for A3 models, made the tank slightly taller and bulkier. Furthermore, the new ammunition storage, while safer than earlier designs, complicated the work of the loader. The biggest complaint, however, was the sacrifice of the high explosive heat capability. The 76mm HE round was demonstrably weaker than the old 75mm round, which meant the upgraded tank was less effective in its primary role of supporting infantry and clearing enemy positions, the very fear McNair had harbored. This led to many commanders, notably General George S. Patton Jr., initially rejecting the 76mm variant in favor of the more versatile 75mm for general duties. A powerful anecdote that illustrates this initial failure of expectation comes from the experiences during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead. As American forces finally pushed into open ground, tank-on-tank encounters became more frequent. In one famous engagement, a column of 76mm Shermans engaged a few Panthers and saw their new rounds fail to penetrate at combat ranges. The crew's morale plummeted, reinforcing the idea that the Sherman, even upgraded, was fundamentally inferior. The 76mm was a good gun, but standard ammunition alone was not enough to overcome the massive structural advantage of German design philosophy. The crisis of confidence persisted. The truth was that the German tank doctrine, emphasizing robust defense and high-velocity long-range engagement, had forced the Americans into a technological race they were only now beginning to win. The 76mm gun was the start, but it was incomplete. The secret, the true equalizer that would finally turn the tide and deliver genuine hope, was not the gun barrel itself, but what was fired out of it. The true turning point in the Sherman's history, and the genesis of the hope the 76mm gun offered, lay in a highly specialized, and initially scarce, projectile, the high-velocity armor-piercing, HVAP, round, designated T4. The HVAP round was a revolutionary concept in armor penetration. Unlike standard armor-piercing rounds, which relied on a single solid piece of steel, the HVAP employed a tungsten carbide core encased in a lighter metal sheath. Tungsten, being exceptionally dense and hard, provided the projectile with maximum penetrative force. The lighter outer sheath, or subcaliber sabot, was discarded after the round left the barrel, allowing the dense core to fly at a phenomenal velocity, around 3,350 feet per second, an incredible increase over the standard 76mm AP round. This was a technology known as armor-piercing, composite rigid, APCR, or later, discarding sabot rounds. The impact of the HVAP round was transformative. Its extreme velocity and dense core gave the 76mm Sherman the penetrative power it had desperately needed. While the standard 76mm round struggled to penetrate the Panther's 80mm glacis plate beyond 500 yards, the HVAP could achieve this penetration at ranges of 1,000 yards or more, essentially squaring the fight. Against the Tiger Eye, the HVAP could reliably penetrate its thick-side armor at combat ranges, and even had a chance against the front if hit at a less than optimal angle or on a weak point. This was the secret. The 76mm gun was merely the launch platform. The hope was delivered by the tungsten core. However, just like the gun itself, the introduction of the HVAP was a frustratingly slow process. Tungsten was a rare and strategic material, making the mass production of the T4 projectile difficult. Furthermore, the HVAP round was initially restricted in theater, often limited to just a few rounds per tank, to be used only against the heaviest German armor, the Tigers and Panthers. This scarcity forced tankers to make agonizing decisions: hold the HVAP for a guaranteed kill, or risk using it on a less threatening but still dangerous target. The psychological shift, however, was immense. For the first time, American tankers knew they had a weapon that, if used correctly, could defeat anything the Germans fielded. This knowledge fundamentally changed their tactical approach. Instead of relying solely on flanking maneuvers, which exposed the Sherman's vulnerable sides, tankers equipped with the 76mm and a few HVAP rounds could engage German armor frontally, albeit selectively and often in ambushes. The effect of the HVAP became evident during the critical fighting in the autumn of 1944 and, most dramatically, during the Battle of the Bulge. During the Bulge, the Germans unleashed their last great armored offensive. The American reaction was swift and desperate. Here, the M4A3E8 Easy-8 Sherman, equipped with the improved 76mm M1A1 gun, a lighter, more balanced version of the M1, and finally stocked with significant quantities of HVAP, proved its worth. The Easy-8, the ultimate fighting version of the Sherman, was reliable, easy to maintain, and now, critically, had the firepower to deter the German advance. Memoirs from the Battle of the Bulge frequently mention the relief of receiving the HVAP. One anecdote, often recounted by veterans of the 4th Armored Division, speaks of a 76mm Sherman crew holding a crossroads against a Panther. After 2 standard rounds bounced, the commander ordered an HVAP. The impact was described as a blinding flash, a geyser of flame, and the immediate incapacitation of the Panther. The quote, often paraphrased, stated simply, "We saw the flash, and we knew we were in the game now. That little round gave us our balls back." The 76mm, armed with the HVAP, was the equalizer. It didn't make the Sherman better than the Panther or the Tiger on a shot-for-shot basis, but it ensured the German tanks could no longer dictate the terms of engagement simply by being present. It gave the American tanker a crucial tactical choice, eliminating the paralysis of knowing that their weapon was worthless. The 76mm gun, particularly with the HVAP, was the necessary technological catch-up, but its impact must be viewed in the broader context of the American war machine. The secret of the Sherman's success was never just one component, it was the entire system that the 76mm gun allowed to function. The German philosophy of armor was one of qualitative superiority. They sought to build the best, most powerful tank, prioritizing protection and firepower above all else. This resulted in mechanical complexity, high maintenance, slow production, and logistical nightmares. The Tiger and Panther were indeed superior in a one-on-one duel, but they were almost constantly breaking down, short on fuel, or stuck in repair depots. The American philosophy, by contrast, was built on reliability, quantity, and speed of repair. 1. Reliability and repair. The Sherman was easy to maintain. A crew could often replace a track, change an engine, or perform battle repairs in a fraction of the time it took a German crew to perform equivalent maintenance on a Panther. The M4's engine, transmission, and components were standardized and easily accessible. American logistical superiority meant that when a Sherman was hit, it was often salvaged, repaired, and returned to combat within days. When a Tiger was hit, it was often abandoned and destroyed because recovery and repair were monumental tasks. 2. Quantity. The sheer number of Shermans produced was a strategic advantage the Germans could not overcome. For every Tiger built, nearly 20 Shermans rolled off the assembly line. The 76mm upgrade, coupled with the continued high volume of production, ensured that the American armored forces could absorb heavy losses and maintain momentum. The ability to bring overwhelming force to bear was the ultimate counter to German qualitative superiority. 3. Combined arms doctrine. General McNair's doctrine, while initially delaying the 76mm, proved strategically sound in the long run. The Sherman was designed to be part of a team: infantry, artillery, air support, and tank destroyers. Artillery support: the United States possessed a massive advantage in fire support. If a German heavy tank was spotted, it was often engaged by heavy artillery or a dedicated tank destroyer like the M10 or M18, before a 76mm Sherman was tasked with the frontal duel. Air superiority: the total air dominance of the Allies meant that German armored movements were constantly vulnerable to attack by fighter bombers like the Pa-47 Thunderbolt, often armed with rockets and bombs that could disable or destroy the heaviest tanks from above. The 76mm as insurance: the 76mm gun, especially with the HVAP, served as essential insurance. It meant that when a Sherman crew did accidentally stumble upon a Tiger or Panther, they were no longer completely helpless. It provided the necessary confidence to execute their primary mission, infantry support and maneuver, without the crushing fear of an unassailable enemy counterattack. The 76mm gun, therefore, did not magically transform the Sherman into a Tiger killer. What it did was enable the superior American doctrine of maneuver, combined arms, and overwhelming logistics to function without being constantly paralyzed by the fear of superior German firepower. The hope was in the knowledge that the technological gap had been closed just enough to matter. The ultimate expression of the 76mm upgrade was the M4A3E8, affectionately known as the Easy 8. This late-war model incorporated not only the high-velocity 76mm gun but also a revolutionary new horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS. This wider track and smoother suspension drastically improved the Sherman's cross-country mobility and speed, making it an even more reliable and versatile fighting platform. By 1945, the Easy-8, utilizing the HVAP round, was a tank that American crews respected and trusted. It was fast enough to flank, reliable enough to keep moving, and now possessed the punch required to compete. The tank had come full circle, moving from a hurried compromise to a highly capable, balanced weapon system perfectly suited for the demands of maneuver warfare in Europe. The final irony is that the Sherman's greatest competitor, the German Panther, was itself technologically flawed. While boasting superior armor and gun, its final drive assembly was notoriously weak, often failing under the stress of rapid movement. This mechanical complexity meant that for every Panther ready for battle, there were two broken down on the side of the road. The Sherman's secret, therefore, was not the gun alone, but the perfect synergy of technology, logistics, and doctrine that the 76mm gun finally completed. The 76mm M1 gun, particularly when firing the specialized HVAP projectile, restored the balance of power. It changed the morale of the American tanker from one of dread to one of confident aggression. It allowed the United States to fight the war on its own terms, not through individual, perfect machines, but through an unstoppable, overwhelming flood of reliable, highly effective, and rapidly produced weapons. The M4 Sherman was never the king of the battlefield, but the 76mm gun ensured it was never the victim either. It was the crucial piece of the puzzle that gave the common soldier, facing down the mythic terror of German steel, the most vital element of all, the hope that they could survive, and the power to win. This is why the 76mm gun stands not just as a technical upgrade, but as the moment the American tanker finally felt truly equipped to win the war in Europe. The legend of the Ronson and the death-trap Sherman has persisted for decades after the guns fell silent, largely fueled by the dramatic, traumatic accounts of the initial 75mm engagements. But historical analysis paints a much more nuanced picture, one where the 76mm M1 gun plays a pivotal role in correcting the initial disparity. The focus on the technical superiority of the German tanks, while accurate, often overlooks the statistical reality of the war. The vast majority of tank engagements were not tank versus tank duels. They were battles against infantry, anti-tank guns, artillery, and mines. In these roles, the 75mm Sherman was arguably superior due to its better high-explosive shell. However, the presence of the 76mm variant with HVAP meant that when the tank versus tank engagement did occur, the Americans were no longer playing a losing hand. By the end of the war, the deployment figures speak volumes. The 76mm M1 gun was mounted on thousands of Shermans across multiple variants, becoming the standard armament for the final push into Germany. The HVAP round, while always constrained by tungsten availability, was deployed strategically to armored divisions, ensuring that every significant offensive had the necessary firepower punch. The enduring success of the Sherman lies in its flexibility, its ability to accept rapid upgrades and modifications in the field. The 76mm gun was the largest and most critical of these modifications, representing the US industrial and engineering complex effectively responding to the shock of combat. The story is not one of a catastrophic design failure, but one of a successful, if painful, adaptation. The initial perception that the Sherman was outgunned was tragically true. The unexpected twist is that the solution was not a completely new tank design, but a highly focused, mass-produced upgrade, the 76mm M1, that, when coupled with a strategic new round, the HVAP, finally delivered the punch that empowered the American soldier. The hope that the 76mm provided was psychological, tactical, and strategic. It meant the American tankers, the men who drove the machines, could finally believe they had a chance. It meant American doctrine, predicated on speed and logistics, could finally overcome the German reliance on heavy steel. It was the gun that finally allowed the American armored fist to smash through the defenses of the Third Reich, confirming the M4 Sherman's place as the tank that, despite its faults, truly won the war. This is the secret of the Sherman. The 76mm gun was not the end of the story, but the beginning of the end for German armored superiority on the Western Front.